Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to the anticipated launch of ISPU's American Muslim Poll 2022. My name's Dalia Mogahid, and I direct research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. I will be presenting the data today and moderating a panel discussion with some amazing experts. So sit back and enjoy this discussion, and we hope that you will also participate at the end with questions and answer. This year's report is a politics and pandemic status report. You can join the conversation on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and those are our handles for ISPU. Please tag ISPU and use hashtag ISPU poll as you follow along on social media. So what we'll be doing today is a brief overview on why this poll, why now, why it's important. We'll then talk to you a little bit about the methodology we used and then jump right into the key findings, followed by a discussion with some key experts and Q&A. So what is this poll about, and what is the backdrop of this study? We are all here entering a new phase of the COVID pandemic, a virus that has left more than 1 million Americans dead, and many more suffering and grieving for lost ones, for those they've lost to this pandemic. It's also a pandemic that has left many without jobs, has created untold economic struggles, and widespread mental health challenges. So that's one key aspect of the backdrop of this study. We are continuing in our country's centuries-old struggle for racial equity. And we're becoming even more aware of the problems we face with gun violence and a growing partisan divide. So it has never been more important, especially now when our country's even grappling with the very health and possibility of democracy, to do a study like this and to report the findings on what Americans believe and think about key issues. This study is our 6th study that looks at American faith and non-faith groups, including American Muslims. Our first one was in 2016. And these studies have really been a key milestone and a key touch point for policymakers, media, and the engaged public alike in understanding the American faith landscape, including and especially American minority groups that are often left out of other studies that look at faith groups, especially American Muslims and American Jews. So this is a nationally representative survey of Muslims, Jews, Protestants, with a subcategorization of white evangelicals, as well as American Catholics and non-affiliated Americans. The topics this study covers include demographics, religious discrimination, and Islamophobia, and these are the ones we're going to be focused on today, but also includes civic engagement, voter suppression, a discussion of hot button issues, and much more. So this is the beginning. This is actually the first of a number of discussions based on this study. We're going to be doing this year something a little different. Rather than put everything in one event, we're going to be doing a monthly series so that we can really give every topic its due justice to each topic. So how did we conduct this poll? Just as we've done every single year since we've started, we've partnered with a research organization, a polling firm, in fact, called SSRS. This is the same polling firm that does polling for CNN, CBS, ABC, The Washington Post, and American Public Media. Sampling and weighting was led by Dr. Jonathan Best, their vice president for advanced scientific methods. He's a longtime member and presenter at APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion Research, as well as a member of the American Statistical Association. So the methodology we've put in place for this poll is really the gold standard of a nationally representative sample of the different faith groups that we just outlined. So all our participants in this poll were given identical surveys. It was a nationally representative sample of Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, subcategory of white evangelicals from among the Protestant group, as well as non-affiliated Americans. And the total sample size was greater than 1,200. Specifically with a Muslim sample size of 807. The survey field date, and this is important to always keep in mind when the survey was fielded, was February 22nd to March 21st of this year. And you can read the entire report on our website at ispu.org/poll. And this is a list of our phenomenal advisors. We've really brought together some of the greatest minds in mental health, in media studies, in polling studies, and more. So key findings. We'll just start out with what we found and then go into detail. Who are American Muslims now? So we wanted to update some of the demographic facts that we've reported on in the past. American Muslims are more likely to be young, so that's still the case. American Muslims are the most likely faith community to also be low income. American Muslims are as likely as others to be college educated. And compared to other groups, American Muslims are more likely to be students and less likely to be retired, a reflection of their overall youth. American Muslims are also job creators, and we'll go into a little bit more detail. They're on par with other faith groups and non-faith groups in their likelihood to serve in the military. And American Muslims across age and race remain among the most devoted to their faith of any faith group in America. And finally, American Muslim religious attendance remains consistent with previous years. It has not gone up or gone down. The second major topic that we'll be discussing today is regarding discrimination and Islamophobia. We designed an Islamophobia Index, and we've reported on the score year after year. Muslims' own Islamophobia Index score is on the rise, and that really is the big finding this year regarding Islamophobia, and that's what we'll be discussing. And we're going to be making sense of the Islamophobia Index among Muslims, with our expert panel. Muslims remain the most likely to report experiencing religious discrimination, and older Muslims are less likely to report religious discrimination, while white Muslims, or Muslims who identify as white, are the most likely. Muslims are more likely than other groups to face religious discrimination in institutional settings, and also the most likely to also face it in interpersonal interactions. And like several times before, Muslim families remain the most likely to have a child bullied for their religion. So some future topics to be on the lookout for that are not included in this report, but will be released over the next 2 years. We're going to be doing a special report on banking while Muslim. We're going to do a deep dive on who are converts, who are Muslim converts, a piece on the American Muslim family, and one on volunteering and neighborhood involvement. So let's go ahead and dive in with who are American Muslims now. Muslims are America's youngest faith community by a lot by far. 26% of American Muslims are between the age of 18 and 24, compared to only 8% in the Jewish community and so forth. You can see across the board, American Muslims are far more likely to be young. Muslims remain America's most likely faith community also to be poor, to live on less than $30,000 a year. And on the other side of the spectrum, $100,000 or more, it's about on par with the rest of America, with the exception of Jewish Americans, who are twice as likely to be of high income as Muslims. So I think this is an important finding that we've reported on many times before, but it's good for us to always be reminded that the idea of all Muslims being rich or all Muslims being doctors or whatever is simply inaccurate. In fact, a third of our community is struggling economically, and we always have to keep that in mind as we build institutions and allocate resources. Black Muslims are more likely than white and Asian Muslims to report low income. Muslims are as likely as other groups to have a college degree or higher, with the group that is most likely to be college educated is Jewish Americans. American Muslims are less likely, the least likely of all other groups to be retired. So American Muslims are by far the most likely to be participating in either education or employment. Now, interestingly, women across most groups are less likely than men to report being employed full-time. American Muslims are no different, no exception to that. As you can see, the orange bar across the board are women who report full-time employment, and then the light blue is men who report the same. The biggest gender gap or gender difference in this regard is among Protestants, and the smallest gender gap, actually zero gender gap, interestingly, is among people who identify as non-affiliated. Nearly 1 in 10 Muslims own their own business, which is not different from most other groups. What does kind of make Muslims different or kind of is somewhat unique among Muslim business owners is that they are more likely to employ more people. So the average number of employees in Muslim-owned businesses is 8 people. And that's far higher than the average number of employees in other, among other groups who own their own business. And that results in an estimated 1.37 million jobs that American Muslims create. And this is a very conservative rough estimate. It actually could be a lot more, but we wanted to be very conservative when we reported this number, 1.37 million jobs that American Muslims contribute to our economy. Muslims are as likely as Catholics and Protestants to serve in the US military, twice as likely as Jewish Americans. So 11% of Muslims are veterans. American Muslims are more likely than most other groups to say religion is very important to them, 70%. This is so consistent across years. I've been doing this, even before at Gallup, and this number almost never changes. However, whatever the company, whether it's Gallup or Pew or ISPU, this is a very stable number. Interestingly, white evangelicals are the only group that is more likely than Muslims to say that religion is important to them, very important to them. This is the percentage who say very important. Now, what is unique about Muslims is that young Muslims are no different than their elders in this regard. Young Muslims are as likely as older Muslims. They're really on par in their likelihood to say that that faith is important to them. This is not the case in the general public, where younger people are less likely to find religion important or relevant to their lives. And another thing that is shared across not only age but race in the Muslim community is this idea of placing importance on faith. So whether a Muslim identifies as Black, white, Asian, or Arab, they're really equally likely to say their faith is an important part of their daily lives. Among the general public, Black Americans are more likely than white and Hispanic Americans to say religion is important. What about attending a mosque or attending a religious service? 42% of American Muslims say that they, before coronavirus, so this is a little bit of a, looking before this exceptional case of COVID, that they attend a religious service once a week or more, 42%. This number, again, is one that has been extremely stable across the years. The group that reports it the most frequent religious attendance are white evangelicals at 72% who attend a religious service. This is a number that's really important to look at because it's so correlated to so many other things, including positive mental health outcomes, actually. Attending a religious service once a week or more has been shown in several studies to be linked to positive mental health outcomes. The other thing it's linked to is greater civic engagement. Muslims equally likely to be unmosqued across gender and age. And I think this is probably somewhat surprising. I think that our conventional wisdom in the Muslim community is that women are more unmosqued than men, or young people more than older people. That's not actually the case. So we're defining unmosqued as they say never. They never go to a mosque. So how often? The answer is never. Doesn't enter the door for the past year. And that's 12% of men, 16% of women, which is statistically similar, on par. Young people, 14%, older people, 14%. So it's very interesting to know that that unmosqued group actually is pretty representative of the entire community, and that has to be addressed. The other thing to note is at least among people who identify as Muslim, so this doesn't include people who grew up Muslim and no longer identify as Muslim, this group is often overestimated. I've heard numbers like 90% of Muslims never go to a mosque. I mean, I've heard the number just kind of gets thrown around from so many different, like the range is huge. This is the number. It's basically around 14%. It's not 40, it's not 80, it is like 14% of Muslims who identify as Muslim, people who identify as Muslim, don't go to mosque at all. So now, after kind of setting the stage with these new demographic facts, let's look at what discrimination and Islamophobia is this year, 2022. So just to give you a refresher for those who are familiar and to get everybody else up to speed, the anatomy of the Islamophobia Index. We designed an index that would measure Islamophobia, defined as endorsement of anti-Muslim tropes. These are the tropes that we included in our index. Most Muslims living in the United States are more prone to violence than others. Most Muslims living in the United States discriminate against women, are hostile to the United States, are less civilized than other people, and are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by other Muslims. Why did we choose these questions? The 5 variables that we've chosen are based on previous research linking these perceptions with greater tolerance for anti-Muslim policies. such as mosque surveillance, racial profiling, greater scrutiny of Muslims at airports, the so-called Muslim ban, and even taking away voting rights from Americans who are Muslim. So we didn't, we didn't choose these tropes kind of from nowhere. These are very research-based, and it's because believing these things is linked with endorsing these policies, these anti-Muslim policies. So there's a very strong link between public opinion and policy, and this is the link. Islamophobia is bad for democracy and security. So we found, in addition to previous research, our own research now shows that a higher Islamophobia index is linked to people being more accepting of military targeting of civilians in a war, greater acceptance of individuals even targeting civilians. So a greater acceptance of violence against unarmed people, a greater acceptance of authoritarian attitudes, such as suspending checks and balances and limiting freedom of the press, and a greater support for discriminatory policies against Muslims, unsurprisingly, such as the Muslim ban and surveillance of mosques. So it's not just bad for Muslims. I guess this is the key point. Islamophobia is bad for democracy in general. It's bad for everyone. Every American should care about the Islamophobia index because it erodes our freedoms. It's also linked to other forms of bigotry, including anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. So let's go ahead and look at what we found in terms of the Islamophobia index this year. So the way that we create the index is we normalize it so that it basically goes from 0 to 100, where if you have 0 means that there is zero endorsement of these tropes. 100 would be complete endorsement of every single respondent of all of these tropes. So a 17 is a number that is actually quite low. Even the highest is a 30. Why I'm going to emphasize this is that Islamophobia is not the norm. It is not socially normative to endorse these tropes. It is actually a significant minority of people, even among groups that you may assume are hostile to Muslims. So this is not the social norm, but it is still important to understand this number and to address it, of course. So where does everyone fall? Jews are actually the lowest this year on the Islamophobia index at 17, non-affiliated at 22, Protestants at 23, the general public at 25, and then Muslims at 26. And that's the big thing that we want to talk about today. Catholics 28 and evangelicals, white evangelicals at 30. So where has that number kind of gone up and down? There's a lot of information in this slide, and you can take a look at it in a lot more detail in the report. But what I would note is that in general, with some exceptions, the numbers are trending down, right? White evangelicals started out in 2018 when we first started measuring at 40, and now are at 30. So progress, right? A lot of groups have sort of either been stable or have trended down. Jews have also, trended from 22, wasn't that high, but now 17. The general public has been pretty stable. So, and Protestants have actually come down a little bit as well. The one and only group that is been trending up have been Muslims, in fact, in their internalization of these tropes and their own endorsement of them. And that is the trend that we want to understand and discuss. Now, when you look at Muslims and you break it down by race, because that's the only, we didn't set out to look at it by race, but it was the one demographic that was kind of really standing out when we looked at all the different demographics. It's not women different from men. It's not young people different from old people as much as it is racially, different. So, among Muslims, the alarming trend really is that among Muslims who identify as white, there has been this steady sort of uptick of endorsing anti-Muslim tropes, where in 2018, people identify as white who are Muslim, their index number was 21, and now in 2022, it's 40. Okay, so it's on par with white evangelicals. Not even white evangelicals now, but white evangelicals in 2018. Now white evangelicals are at 30. So they're higher by 10 points, versus white evangelicals. Why is this happening? This is something we need further, research and discussion on. The other groups, it's basically they're driving, Muslims identify as white are kind of driving this number being higher among Muslims. Among Black, Asian, and Arab Muslims, it is much lower. Okay, so when you look at it by race in the general public, Islamophobia remains stable among white and Hispanic Americans in the general public and has actually come down in terms of the index score among Black Americans. And now the three groups are identical at around basically an average of 25. So we can look at, by trope, 1/4 of Muslims agree with the trope that Muslims are prone to violence more than other groups. Now, we have an entire link that you can check out, which kind of breaks down each trope and explains why it is false. So these are false tropes, regardless of the fact that 1/4 of Muslims have endorsed them. And I'm not saying they're false because they offend me, they're false because they're empirically false. Most Muslims and Jews, however, do reject the notion that Muslims discriminate against women. And Muslims as likely as Catholics and white evangelicals to agree that Muslims are hostile to the United States. Nearly 1 in 5 Muslims agree with the trope that Muslims are less civilized than other people. And Muslims are the most likely to agree that Muslims are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by others. Now, what I found really interesting about many of these is they fall along lines of a very strong narrative that Muslims have sort of consumed for at least the past 20 years. Muslims remain the most likely to report experiencing religious discrimination. Now, we've heard that there's this significant percentage of Muslims who have endorsed these tropes, and at the same time, there's this stable kind of year after year, a majority of Muslims have reported experiencing some cost to being a Muslim. And these two things are not unrelated. And I think we'll discuss that a little bit more in the panel. Muslims are most likely to face discrimination in institutional settings, far more likely than any other faith group. So whether it's applying for a job, interacting with law enforcement, at the airport, when receiving healthcare, and on social media, from social media platforms themselves. But they're also more likely than other groups to experience religious discrimination in personal interactions, like when interacting with coworkers or on social media from other users. And then again, nearly half of Muslim families report a child has faced religious-based bullying, with an alarming 20% of that total saying it happened every single day or almost every day, far more likely than Jewish Americans or anyone in the general public. Now, Muslim families who report facing that their child has faced religious-based discrimination, it's happening both from other students, as well as adults, both in person and online. Now, the most common is at school from other students, but 42% of the bullying incidents people say that it was a teacher or school official at school, and 19% say it was a teacher or school official online. So this is always what alarms us, is that it's adults as well as other children. And that points to the need for greater training of staff on this issue. And I'm going to end with recommendations so we can jump into our discussion. We have an urgent need among the Muslim, so we have the recommendations are sort of split into different stakeholder groups. We're going to start now with Muslim community leaders. There's an urgent need to address Muslim mental health challenges with greater awareness and resource allocation. And this is because of not only the pandemic, but also this steady drumbeat of religious discrimination, and now this greater internalization of anti-Muslim tropes. We need to educate the community to report institutional Islamophobia and bullying to relevant authorities. We need to promote and facilitate careers in media and mental health to young people to help correct these issues. And then we need to engage in intra-Muslim conversations about race and racial healing. And we need to recognize internalized Islamophobia as a major challenge facing young Muslims and older Muslims, and integrate accurate information about the community into educational content. It's not just people outside the community that need to understand who Muslims are and what they do and these empirical facts about who actually is committing violence. Muslims need to hear that because they're consuming the same media as everybody else. Interfaith allies seek to partner with Muslim organizations and leaders on issues of collective importance, include anti-Islamophobia content in your inclusion and diversity training, familiarize your networks with the manifestations and roots of Islamophobia, and recognize Islamophobia as both individual and institutional. And then social media companies, engage Muslim communities in a review of your platform community norms and the application of policies toward Muslim users. Review anti-bullying safeguards from a religious discrimination informed lens. Consider applying misinformation warnings to anti-Muslim conspiracy theories and false claims, and include anti-Islamophobia content in your inclusion and diversity training policies and hiring practices. And then finally, educators, include anti-Islamophobia content in your training. Teach about the contributions of diverse communities, especially those of children in your classroom, which will include Muslims. Discuss bullying in your classroom, what it sounds like, and how bystanders can stand up to bullies. Explore your own unintended bias and educate yourself about the children under your care. And then finally, provide a concrete way to address bullying by adults. And I'm going to stop here because I really want to get to the panel, but we have a set of recommendations for media professionals as well, especially to make use of our resources. Mark your calendar for our next webinars as well. September 15th, we're going to look at abortion legality. October 13th, civic engagement, and November 3rd, views on climate change. And these will all be a part of your follow-up email. So panel discussion, I'm going to stop sharing so we can bring on our panelists. Let me get out my notes. Okay, wonderful. Let me introduce our phenomenal panel. I'll start with Dr. Muniba Saleem, who is an associate professor in media psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara's Department of Communication, and a faculty associate at the Institute for Social Research. Dr. Saleem's research explores the role of media in interpersonal and intergroup relations between racial, ethnic, and religious groups using social scientific methods. Recent work has examined how the same negative media depictions influence minority members' social, psychological, and political outcomes. Dr. Mustapha Byumi is the author of the critically acclaimed How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America, which won an American Book Award and the Arab American Book Award for nonfiction. Bayoumi is also a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Magazine, the Daily Beast, The Nation, CNN.com, and many others. Dr. Kameelah Rashad is the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting healing and emotional well-being in the American Muslim community through dialogue, education, and training. Through Muslim Wellness Foundation, Dr. Rashad has established the annual Black Muslim Psychology Conference and the Deeply Rooted Emerging Leaders Fellowship for Black Muslim Young Adults. Dr. Rashad is also the founding co-director of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition, an initiative launched in collaboration with the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaboration, Muslim ARC, to address the needs for effective planning, preparedness, and organizing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Abed Ayoub, who serves as the National Executive Director of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, congratulations, by the way, and the country's largest, which is the country's largest Arab American civil rights organization based here in Washington, D.C. Through his position, Ayoub works to address issues impacting Arabs and Muslims in the United States, including discrimination, hate crimes, and profiling. Ayoub is a native of Dearborn, Michigan, which is home to the largest concentration of Arab Americans. Thank you all so much for being with us. I'm so excited about this panel. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Saleem, Dr. Muniba. How your work focuses on media portrayals and especially on how they impact not only the general public, but on the targeted community. So can you help us understand, make sense of this research that we just saw? How does the media portrayal of American Muslims contribute to internalized Islamophobia?
Assalamu alaikum. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So first of all, I just want to thank the organizers, Dahlia, everybody else for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here among such esteemed panelists and the audience. I'm excited to talk about this because it's really important to the work that I do. So to respond to this question, I want to point out that 3 of the 5 items on the Islamophobia Index associate Muslims with violence and aggression. And association of Muslims with violence and aggression has been well documented in several content analyses of different media outlets, including news, entertainment, children's literature, video games. And so there's content analyses, for instance, in the entertainment world, one that I was recently involved with, led by Dr. Ian Hawkins. It revealed that from 1996 to 2014, 73 of the 153 MENA characters examined in television episodes were shown to be connected with terrorism in some way. That's about 46% of the characters were associated with terrorism in some way. Another content analysis examined network and cable news, revealed that 81% of the terrorists on news are portrayed as Muslims, when in reality, during that year of the study, FBI data revealed that 6% of the terrorist attacks were perpetrated by Muslims. There's a big difference between 6 and 81%. And at the same time, even though FBI reports for that year revealed that 94% of the terrorist attacks were perpetrated by non-Muslims, media depicted only 19% of the terrorists as non-Muslim. You can see there's a tendency to represent Muslims as terrorists, as violent, as aggressive. Now, in the last 20 years, there's been several studies that have examined the effects of these representation on non-Muslims' perceptions of Muslims. So studies reveal that both in the short and in the long term, exposure to these depictions of Muslims as violent can increase hostility towards Muslims, as well as support for policies that are targeting Muslims abroad, but also in the US. But the question is that we're talking about today, how do these depictions affect Muslims themselves? And this has been an area that's been increasingly studied in the last decade. My own work and that of other scholars shows that Muslims are frustrated with and concerned about the way in which their religious group is represented in Western media. Not only does this exposure cause feelings of shame, guilt, and embarrassment, but it has detrimental consequences for one's self-image, self-esteem, and even collective esteem. So the way that we think about the Muslim collective. These feelings in turn can motivate adverse coping behaviors like distancing and disengaging from the mainstream society, from the American identity or the British identity or whichever Western country you're living in. For adolescent and youth who are in the midst of negotiating their social identities, such experiences can cause identity conflicts and reduce feelings of belongingness and support from any community. And in that vulnerable stage where youth feel unsupported, a lack of belonging, and a sense that their identity is negatively stigmatized, there's a heightened risk of adverse interpersonal and intergroup consequences, including mental health concerns like we talked about, academic performance, aggression, and negative intra and intergroup relations. Now, these are the effects and consequences of the ways that Muslims are represented in American media, but of course, we're all interested in understanding how we can fix these. And I appreciate you, Dalia, talking about some of those suggestions, but I want to focus quickly on some media-oriented suggestions that are important. So one, we can think about how the content can be changed and improved, but also we can think about how the audience can be taught to critically evaluate what they see in the media. So from the content side, there are organizations such as the Islamic Scholarship Fund and others that are specifically trying to create programs to encourage young and emerging media creators to represent Muslims in a nuanced way, to encourage Muslims to go into those professions to change the way in which their group is being depicted. There are also efforts to encourage media creators to think critically about the way they're depicting Muslims. For example, Riz Ahmed recently came up with the Riz test to encourage media creators to think about how stereotypically Muslims are depicted in the content. He has a list of suggestions, and if media creators fail those suggestions, then they fail the Riz test. Apart from these strategies that are aiming at changing the content, I want to highlight that you, the audience, also have the power to discuss and criticize the content that you see, hear, and read. For example, there are grassroots efforts on social media where groups can actively counter misinformation and disinformation presented about their groups by posting comments, sharing news stories, and presenting information to negate the stereotypical representation of your group. We found in empirical studies that such counter-arguing efforts on social media by Muslims and non-Muslims can improve attitudes towards Muslims by the bystanders that are viewing this content on their social media feeds, even if they're not the ones that are perpetrating it or if it's relevant to them. So I would encourage everybody here to take an active responsibility and part in countering this disinformation and misinformation and negative stereotypes that are so prevalent in our media against Muslims. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Mustapha Byumi. You know, our conversations have been so influential on me in my own thinking about Islamophobia and internalized Islamophobia, Dr. Bayoumi. So thank you so much. 44% of American Muslims said that they personally felt ashamed when they hear that a member of their faith community committed an act of violence. And that was a question that was inspired by a conversation with you, that we asked that question at all. And that's the highest of any percentage. So when Jews hear about a member of their group or Protestants or any other faith group, it's much lower percentage feel personal shame, whereas Muslims are the highest. Can you speak on how this collective blame is linked to internalized Islamophobia?
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Dalia, and everyone at ISPU. What a pleasure and honor it is to be here to speak to you today. And what an important study this is. Every year, the information is always useful. This year, I think it's so important because I think it also taps into a lot of contemporary trends that are very important for the nation, not just for the Muslim American community. And so I think I want to frame my comments a little bit answering Dalia's question and around that question as well. You know, in American society, the idea, though certainly not always the practice, is that guilt is individual, right? And it's not collective. We are subjects who are individually responsible for our own behaviors and for our own actions. If your father or sister is found guilty of a crime, for example, that crime doesn't translate to you. It's not like you can go to prison and serve the sentence for your family member. For the most part, that is the way that it works in the United States, even in the court of public opinion. Well, maybe I should be more specific. That's the way that it works for the white majority, right? But we all know that it's different for people of color and for other minorities in the United States. especially in the court of public opinion. Collective blame is routinely assigned to groups for the alleged actions of individuals. When a white male commits an act of violence, the common reaction is to examine the perpetrator with social complexity, like he's a mystery to be unraveled. Whereas if a Muslim commits an act of violence, the reaction we've learned to expect is, well, calls to close the border. Further emphasizing the idea that Muslims are somehow perpetual foreigners to this country, a country that they've helped build from its origins. Media portrayals, of course, emphasize and exacerbate the problems that we were just hearing about. Another study that I can raise very, very quickly was a recent study from this year that found that 80% of US newspaper news articles about Muslims were negative, far more than any other faith group. So what does this lead to? I think it leads to the idea that Muslims are presumptively guilty in the court of public opinion until you, as an individual Muslim, separate yourself out from the group. This is the kind of logic that Mahmoud Mamdani actually identified 20 years ago in his book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. We're presumptively assumed to be bad Muslims until you prove that you are not one of the bad group, but you are part of the good group. This is, of course, an extremely corrosive logic, and it is, needless to say, both racist and Islamophobic. And it can produce all kinds of damage and dissonance with one's identity, especially since it means that you are allowing a dominant and Islamophobic culture to define not just your own identity, but also your relationship with the rest of your community. And I think this is where shame becomes a political emotion, a conservative political emotion, one that ends up reinforcing collective blame rather than questioning why this differential treatment itself happens. In this way, shame is also a way of thinking about a certain kind of loss of control that it means when you are stuck in a racist and Islamophobic society. I think it's important to emphasize that Muslim Americans don't live in a vacuum, however. They're exposed to the same media, participate in the same broader culture, and are members of multiple groups, like all Americans are. And Muslim Americans, as we know, are extremely diverse along so many different axes. So I find it extremely interesting that at a time when white identity is at the center of so much of the conservative politics of this country in the last few years, that white Muslims are the ones who seem to be leading the pack on internalized Islamophobia. It's also very interesting that white Muslims are more likely to report religious discrimination than other Muslims of color. I think those are the two things that are really we should be talking about today. The idea of internalized Islamophobia is very important to understand, and I wonder how much of it points to one thing or to many things. As a society, I believe that we're currently witnessing a kind of reconsideration and perhaps even a reconsolidation of whiteness today nationally. How that fits within the American Muslim community is such an important question, and one that really has important implications for American Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it today. Hopefully we can engage that question in our further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bayoumi. It is a very interesting link actually between reporting regular religious discrimination and at the same time endorsing anti-Muslim tropes. And there is some research to show that that is a coping mechanism, is to actually endorse the view of, it's called fawning. It might be a little different than fawning, but it's like endorsing the view of your oppressors is a way that some people cope with that oppression. Turning now to Dr. Kameelah, I'm so interested in your thoughts on what can the research about internalized racism inform us? How can that research inform us about this issue of internalized Islamophobia?
Thank you, Dalia and ISPU, for another great poll that gives us so much, just so much to ponder and to consider. I'm going to speak, I know we're near time, so I want to kind of make a few key points. Picking up on Dr. Bayoumi's point, I think in relationship to trying to understand how white Muslim views are fueling the increase in the Islamophobia Index, as well as their report of experiencing higher religious discrimination. I think it's important that we think about how we're defining white Muslims, and acknowledging that we're considering a group of community members that can be sort of ethnically Arab but identify racially as white, also those who are white American converts to Islam, those who are descendants of those who are European American and have immigrated to this country. So also a diverse group of individuals. And I think what this points to, just to connect back to the 22 ISPU poll, was the finding that about 31% of white Muslims supported the re-election of Trump. And that was another finding, like how is race sort of playing out within the American Muslim community? So I think here we have to consider more deeply the concept of racial salience, right? So how essential, or to what extent are white Muslims considering their racial identity and how they're perceived in the broader society? I think we also have to think about a psychological concept called attributional ambiguity. And that is, trying to understand difficulty that members of stigmatized or negatively stereotyped groups may have in interpreting feedback, right, or experiences of prejudice and discrimination. So imagine if you're a white Muslim with racial privilege, but religiously minoritized, it might seem to be clearly linked to your religious identity. Whereas for a Black Muslim like myself, if I experience some degree of discrimination, I am not always sure, right, whether or not that is related to gender, race, or religion, or some kind of combination of all three of those identities. And so I think what might be happening here, and absolutely believe that we need to explore it further, is racial salience. To what degree is race or whiteness sort of one of those salient identities of white Muslims? If they're struggling with attributional ambiguity, or for white Muslims who have racial privilege, there is a clear link to the discriminatory act to their Muslim identity. And so they're reporting higher levels of religious discrimination. It may not mean that they're experiencing it at a higher degree than other non-white Muslims. The last thing that I'll say is that we are interpreting the results in light of internalized Islamophobia, where I think that there's a possibility here that what we're also seeing sort of manifested in these scores is internalized white supremacy. So to what extent do I consider, right, those Black and brown Muslims, as Islam has been racialized, right, as a Black and brown religion, that those Muslims are perhaps demonstrating or expressing to some degree those tropes, whereas given my whiteness, right, I am separate and apart, right, from those stereotypes that apply to most Muslims. So I think when we consider the intersection of racial privilege and religious minoritized status, how are white Muslims perceiving themselves and their connection to the broader American Muslim community? And to what extent are we understanding the diversity within the white Muslim community and their feelings of solidarity across racial lines? So I hope we can take a really deeper dive into that data in the near future.
Yes, and we absolutely plan to. I will just point to one thing which we'll be discussing in future research, that when we do break out the converts, because this year we actually asked if people had been raised Muslim or not, that convert white Muslims are on par with Black and brown Muslims in their endorsement of anti-Muslim tropes. So they are very low. It's actually among people who grew up Muslim and identify as white that the scores are the highest. So just wanted to mention that point because we do know that. Abed, we know from previous research as well that sectarian discrimination is one, or experiencing sectarian discrimination within the Muslim community is one of the predictors of internalized Islamophobia. So what are some recommendations to raise awareness about this issue and address the divide within the community along sectarian lines?
Thank you, Dalia, and the team at ISPU. I want to echo my colleagues on the importance of the reports you put out every year and the information And this report is really great and in some ways eye-opening. And, you know, the issue of sectarianism does fall into this internalized Islamophobia and this conversation that's happening. And, you know, unfortunately, it's an issue that's not talked about often. It's something that we do need to discuss. And as we saw, you know, from the New Mexico situation a few weeks ago, the issue has been brought to the forefront. So this is a positive step. And we got to recognize that, look, sectarianism is there. You know, where it's coming from, how it's, you know, being manifested in our communities is a longer conversation we could have, and how we can tackle it. It is there. I think, you know, I like Dr. Kamal's point about the internalized white supremacy that's happening. Are our younger folks picking up, you know, this sectarianism from spaces, you know, on the internet and where right-wing, you know, conspiracy theories are put out there, and how it ties into, you know, some of these outside forces pushing sectarianism for their own benefit and weakening our community, and, you know, putting this in the minds of Muslim community members. So that's there, and sectarianism has always been there, and it's there. It's something we do need to address. The way I look at it is this: in the United States, in America, we have an advantage as Muslims in that we can freely talk about this. We can get around a table, we can get, you know, with our community groups, our organizations, and our mosques to discuss this openly and freely. And dialogue, education, and preaching tolerance is the way. And I know that sounds cliche, that sounds as, you know, we hear that for everything, but it's really important to do that. It's important we share, you know, everything we have in common. As a diverse Muslim community, the unity that we have, all that we do have, you know, we share together, and the commonalities. And we have to stress, look, there's going to be differences in beliefs. We can acknowledge those, we can respect those. That doesn't weaken us or make us sectarian in any way. If you believe one thing and I believe another, our foundation and our core is the same. And we do need to start preaching this, and we do need to start addressing this, you know, in our mosques and in our institutions. And it's not going to be easy. You may get pushback initially, but it needs to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we're leaving a space where others are coming in to fill it. And this is where the white supremacy rhetoric can come in. If we're not talking about this, then are these 30% of people who support Trump, for example, are they listening to his anti-Iranian policies, and thus in turn turning those into anti-Shia beliefs in the US? There needs to be a counter in this space, and we do need to get a hold of the conversation before, you know, right-wing beliefs and right-wing medias in these spaces fill that void. Our youth, our community needs to hear from the imams, from the scholars, not from folks with large Twitter followings or social media followings pretending to be experts on Islam or pretending to be fans on Islam that are putting this information out there. So it's going to be a challenge, but it is definitely out there. It does contribute, but of all the contributors to internalized Islamophobia, I personally believe sectarianism is the one that's the most easily addressed, and the one that we could most easily get a handle of immediately. So, and you know, your report is helping bring that forward, and hopefully we can continue that conversation.
Thank you so much, Abed. And unfortunately, we won't have time to take questions for this particular panel, but thank you, first of all, to the thoughtful panelists. I learned so much, as I always do, by hearing your insights. And I also want to thank all of those who have invested time today to be with us today. Your feedback is very important, so please take a few minutes to fill out the poll that we just launched. The full report is shared in the chat, and we will also be emailing it, a link to it in your follow-up email. Just a reminder, this is the first webinar in a series, again, that will be a deep dive into different topics covered in this report. So please mark your calendar for those dates where we will be continuing this conversation on different topics. And if you're in Michigan, join us for a family fun picnic at Three Cedars Farm on Saturday, September 17th. Please continue to be ambassadors for the facts and share our research with your network. In the follow-up email that you'll be receiving next week, you'll have a ton of resources relevant to this topic, so please do share with your network. And thank you very much for being here.